Hello, everyone. I am a storyteller, and I am here to offer my support today. I understand that you are likely using this video to help you drift off to sleep. Before we begin, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I would also be interested to know where you are located and what time it is for you. Now, please get comfortable and take a moment to relax. Cooperstown, New York is known for its baseball legends and picturesque landscapes, but few speak of the old Holloway estate, hidden deep in the woods just beyond Otsego Lake. It had stood there for centuries, abandoned, its history whispered about in hushed tones by the locals. No one stays past midnight, they would say. The trees remember. A mysterious invitation. Ethan Carter, a paranormal investigator, received an anonymous email inviting him to the Holloway estate. The message simply read, "Prove them wrong. The house is not empty." Curious, Ethan packed his gear, camera, voice recorder, and an old map of Cooperstown's lesser-known trails. His friend Lila, an urban explorer, insisted on coming along. "It's just another abandoned house," she said. "What's the worst that could happen?" They arrived at dusk. The mansion was eerily silent, save for the rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. The porch creaked as they stepped onto it, the wood sagging under their weight. Ethan pushed open the front door. It wasn't locked. The house that breathed inside. The air was thick, stale, like a place long forgotten. Their flashlights illuminated the grand hallway, revealing dust-covered portraits on the walls. The eyes of the painted figures seemed to follow them. As they ventured deeper, the temperature dropped. Leela exhaled, watching her breath mist in the dim light. Then they heard it. A whisper, a low, breathy voice floating through the air, as if carried by the wind. "Turn back." Lila froze. "Did you hear that?" Ethan nodded, pressing record on his device. He played it back, and this time the voice was clearer. "You should not be here." Then, footsteps above them, slow, deliberate, heavy. They weren't alone. The thing in the mirror. Following the sound, they ascended the dusty staircase, each step echoing through the silence. The second floor was lined with doors, most of them locked, except for one. The door creaked open to reveal an old study, bookshelves filled with ancient tomes. In the center stood a large mirror, its glass oddly pristine despite the decay around it. Ethan approached, raising his flashlight. His reflection stared back, but then it blinked and smiled. But Ethan hadn't. His reflection stepped forward, out of the mirror. Lila screamed as the room plunged into darkness. The escape Ethan scrambled backward, feeling an icy grip on his wrist. The thing from the mirror wasn't letting go. "We must leave now!" Lila shouted, grabbing an old candlestick and swinging it through the air. It passed straight through the creature, but the distraction was enough. Ethan yanked free and they bolted for the door. The house shook, the walls groaning like a living beast. The front door had vanished. "Not real, not real, not real," Ethan muttered, forcing himself to look away from the shifting shadows. He grabbed Lila's hand and ran toward the nearest window. With a desperate leap, they crashed through the glass, tumbling onto the damp earth below. The house screamed behind them, a sound like 1,000 voices crying out at once. Then, silence. They looked back. The mansion was gone. The warning Ethan and Lila never spoke of that night. They left Cooperstown the next morning, shaken but alive. Weeks later, Ethan reviewed his recordings. Most of them were static, except for one. A voice, low and distorted, whispering, "The haunting never left Ethan," and Lila had escaped the Holloway estate, but the nightmare followed them. Days after returning home, Ethan started noticing things. At first it was small, a flickering light, a whisper in the wind. Then came the scratches on his bedroom walls. Every morning, fresh marks appeared, spelling out a single word: return. Lila refused to talk about that night, but Ethan couldn't ignore it. The house was gone when they left, but something from inside had escaped with them. The mark of the Holloway curse. One evening, Ethan stood in front of his bathroom mirror, washing his face. When he looked up, his reflection didn't move. It watched him. Then it smiled. Ethan stumbled backward. The light bulb above him shattered, plunging the room into darkness. The whisper returned. The trees remember. Ethan grabbed his keys. He had to find Lila. Lila hadn't answered her phone in 2 days. Ethan drove straight to her apartment, knocking frantically on her door. No answer. He pushed it open. Unlocked. Inside, the air was stale, just like the Holloway estate. The windows were covered, the lights flickering. Then he saw the writing on the walls. Return, scrawled in deep, jagged letters, scratches like fingernails against the paint. And in the middle of the room stood a mirror. Lila was inside it. Her eyes were wide with terror, mouth moving in silent screams. She pounded on the glass, but no sound came through. Behind her, a shadowy figure loomed. It turned its head toward Ethan and smiled. The final warning. The lights went out. A cold breath brushed against Ethan's ear. The trees remember. Then, darkness. Ethan woke up outside, lying on the damp earth near Otsego Lake. The Holloway estate was back, and the front door was wide open. Lila was waiting, or at least something wearing her face. The Holloway estate calls them. Back, Ethan stood at the edge of Otsego Lake, staring at the impossible sight before him. The Holloway estate had returned. It stood exactly as they had left it. Its rotting wood, towering windows, and that wide open door, as if it had been expecting him. And there, just beyond the doorway, stood Lila, or at least something that looked like her. Her eyes were empty, too dark, like twin wells of ink. Her lips curved into a slow, unnatural smile. Ethan, she called, her voice echoing unnaturally. You left me behind. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, but he took a step forward instead. The return to Holloway. The air grew heavier as Ethan stepped inside. The house felt different this time, more alive. The walls breathed, expanding and contracting with every step. The floors groaned like a beast in its sleep. And then, the door slammed shut behind him. The whispering began immediately. Welcome home. Ethan turned to Lila. What happened to you? She tilted her head. I never left. The mirrors that see too much. She led him up the dusty staircase, her footsteps making no sound. The house twisted as they walked, hallways shifting, doors appearing where they hadn't been before. They entered a room filled with mirrors. Ethan's reflection was everywhere. But as he moved, some of them didn't match his movements. One by one, the reflections turned their heads toward him and smiled. Ethan stepped back. They stepped forward, and then one of them reached out of the glass. The grinning ones. The reflection's fingers curled around Ethan's wrist, ice cold and too strong. Lila laughed softly behind him, her voice distorted. You don't belong out there anymore. Ethan yanked his arm free, stumbling backward. The mirror cracked, its surface rippling like water. The reflections whispered together in unison. One must stay. The lights flickered. The walls shuddered. Ethan turned to run, but Lila was blocking the door. Her smile widened, stretching beyond what was humanly possible. Your turn, she whispered. Then she shoved him straight into the mirror. Trapped Ethan fell through the glass into an endless void. His screams never echoed. And then he was standing in a perfect copy of the Holloway estate. But outside the windows, there was only darkness. A shape moved behind him. He spun around to see himself. But the other Ethan had black eyes, and he was smiling. The last thing Ethan heard before the darkness swallowed him was the whisper of the house itself. The trees remember. Meanwhile, outside, Lila, or whatever had been wearing her face, walked out of the Holloway estate. She turned to the house, watching as its walls groaned and twisted, sealing its new prisoner inside. Then she smiled, a perfect human smile, and walked back toward town to find someone new. The Holloway curse spreads. 3 months had passed since Ethan vanished. His apartment remained untouched. His phone abandoned on his desk. No records of him leaving Cooperstown. No missing person reports, because no one remembered him, except for one person. Meet Daniel Harper. Daniel Harper was a history professor at the local college, specializing in Cooperstown's forgotten past. He had come across an old newspaper article, one that shouldn't exist. It mentioned the Holloway estate, a house that had burned down over a century ago, and yet people kept seeing it. Daniel's research led him to a name that didn't belong in any records: Ethan Carter. Something was off. People he spoke to hesitated when he mentioned Ethan. Some even changed the subject entirely. One librarian's hand trembled as she whispered, "The trees remember." That night, Daniel found an email in his inbox. No sender, no subject, just one line. "The house is real. The mirrors are doors. Help me," and attached, a photo of Ethan. The invitation, Daniel couldn't sleep. He checked the town records again. No birth certificate, no driver's license, no trace of Ethan Carter. But something inside him knew Ethan was real. The next day he went to Otsego Lake, and there it was. The Holloway estate, the house that shouldn't exist. Daniel stepped closer, heart pounding. The front door swung open, as if it had been expecting him. Inside, a whisper curled through the air. "Come inside, Daniel." And from the darkness of the hallway, Ethan stepped out, but his eyes were wrong, and he was smiling. The house once more. Daniel's breath hitched as Ethan stepped forward. The man looked the same as the photo from the email, same face, same clothes, but his eyes were wrong. Too dark, too empty, and his smile, it wasn't human. "You found me," Ethan said, voice soft, almost relieved. Daniel took a step back. "What happened to you?" Ethan tilted his head. "Come inside and I'll show you." The whispering intensified, slithering through the trees, rustling the dead leaves at Daniel's feet. The trees remember. Daniel knew he should run. Every instinct in his body screamed to leave, to forget, to never return. But Ethan had reached out his hand, and Daniel, against all reason, took it. Inside the Holloway estate, the air inside was thick, pressing against Daniel's skin like damp cloth. The walls breathed, the chandeliers flickered. The house was alive. Ethan led him down the hallway, his footsteps silent against the rotting floorboards. Mirrors lined the walls. Too many, each one showing Daniel's reflection, except some of them lagged behind. One, just one, was different. It didn't show Daniel, it showed Lila. She stood inside the glass, her lips moving soundlessly, pounding, screaming. Daniel's pulse spiked. He turned to Ethan. "Who is she?" Ethan's smile widened. "The first one to be taken." Then he shoved Daniel hard. Daniel stumbled backward, straight into the mirror. The reflection that wasn't him. Daniel hit the ground with a gasp. Except he wasn't in the house anymore. He was in a copy of it. a perfect, empty mirror world version, and standing in front of him was himself, or rather something wearing his face. It smiled. One must stay. Daniel turned to run, but the glass behind him had already sealed. From the other side of the mirror, Ethan stood watching, no longer smiling. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and then he turned and walked away. Outside, a new Daniel emerges. The other Daniel stepped out of the Holloway estate. He inhaled deeply, stretching his limbs, rolling his shoulders, as if getting used to his new body. Then he smiled and walked back toward town to find someone new. The cycle must break. The other Daniel walked into town, his new body settling into place. He felt the weight of this world, the warmth of the sun, the cool breeze off Otsego Lake. It had been so long since he had been real. But there was still one loose end. The man who remembered late that night, the new Daniel sat in his apartment, flipping through old town records, searching for someone like him. And that's when he found it, an old faded article from 1924. Local man Thomas Holloway, found wandering near Otsego Lake, claims family home still stands, despite fire destroying it decades ago. Authorities dismiss his claims as hysteria. Holloway institutionalized. Daniel, the real Daniel, the one trapped in the mirror world, had seen that name before. Holloway, the name of the house. And then, a knock at his door. The new Daniel grinned. Right on time. The survivor outside, an old man, stood, his face pale, his eyes sharp with recognition. "You're not him," the man whispered. The new Daniel smiled. "Neither are you." The man, Thomas Holloway, the last survivor of the original family, held up something, a rusted, broken shard of mirror. The reflection inside it, not Daniel, not Thomas, but something else, and it was watching them both. The whispering returned, curling through the air. "The trees remember." Thomas slammed the mirror shard against the ground, and the world shattered. The Holloway estate falls. Deep in the woods, the Holloway estate groaned. Its walls buckled, its windows cracked, and then it collapsed into itself. The mirrors inside shattered, freeing dozens of trapped souls, including Ethan and the real Daniel. They stood in the ruins, gasping for breath, feeling real again. The house was gone. The curse was broken, or so they thought. The final whisper. As they left the woods, Ethan paused, glancing back one last time. In the distance, the trees swayed, even though there was no wind. And then, from deep within the forest, something whispered, "The trees remember, and they always will. The curse never dies." The Holloway estate was gone. The mirrors were shattered. The souls were freed. But something still felt wrong. Ethan and Daniel walked back toward town with Thomas Holloway, the last living member of the cursed family. The night air was still, too still. No crickets, no wind, no sound. And then Thomas stopped walking. Ethan turned to him. "Are you okay?" Thomas's hands trembled. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. No. I was wrong," he whispered. "It wasn't the house. It was never the house." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Thomas's voice cracked. "The house was just a doorway. The curse was always in the land." Ethan's stomach dropped. He turned to look back at the forest, and the trees had moved. The forest awakens. The towering pines that surrounded the Holloway estate weren't in the same place. The path they had walked was gone, rearranged. The trees had shifted when they weren't looking. The whispering returned. "The trees remember." A shadow moved between the trunks, then another, and another. Eyes, too many eyes, blinked open in the bark, watching them. And then, as one, the forest exhaled. A gust of cold, rancid wind rushed toward them. Ethan grabbed Thomas's arm. "We have to move!" The chase through the woods. They ran, but the trees weren't trees anymore. Their trunks twisted. Their roots lunged like grasping hands. The ground shifted beneath their feet, forcing them deeper into the woods instead of out. Daniel tripped. He looked up, just in time to see a figure standing ahead of them. It was a man. No, it was something wearing the shape of a man. His body was made of wood and rot. His face stretched into a grotesque grin. His eyes were hollow knots in the bark of his skull. And when he spoke, the trees whispered with him. "One must stay." Ethan and Daniel yanked Thomas to his feet. They sprinted toward the last break in the trees. And just as they reached the edge of the woods, the ground split open beneath Thomas. He screamed as the roots pulled him down. Ethan grabbed his hand, trying to hold on, but Thomas's body was already changing. His skin darkened. His fingers grew into branches. His eyes pleading 1 second, gone the next. And then he was just another tree, motionless, silent. The forest behind them went still. The whispering stopped. Ethan and Daniel collapsed onto the road outside the woods, gasping for breath. The Holloway estate was gone, but the trees were still there, and they had claimed someone new. The final warning. As Ethan and Daniel walked back into town, neither of them spoke, but Ethan knew the truth. The house had been destroyed, but the curse still lived, and one day, the trees would whisper again. The woods are hungry. Ethan and Daniel tried to forget. They moved away from Cooperstown, never spoke of that night. They ignored the nightmares, the whispers in their dreams. But curses don't just end. They wait, and sometimes they follow. A new beginning, or a trap. 1 year later, Daniel had rebuilt his life in a quiet town far from New York. He had a new job, new friends, a normal life. Until one morning, a letter arrived at his doorstep. No stamp, no return address, just 4 words written in shaky ink. "The trees remember you." Daniel's stomach twisted. He threw the letter away, telling himself it was a prank. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard something outside his window. Not the wind, not an animal. Something breathing, slow, heavy, wrong. He refused to look, refused to believe, until knock, knock, knock. A fist, or something like one, rapped against his window pane. And then, a voice. One must stay. The curse never left. Daniel bolted upright. His breath came in ragged gasps. The window was closed, nothing outside. But his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It was a photo of a tree, a new tree. And carved into its bark, deep and jagged, was his own name. Daniel's heart stopped, because at the base of that tree, barely visible in the dark, were footprints leading away from it, fresh, headed straight for his house, too late to run. Daniel didn't think. He grabbed his car keys, threw open his door, and ran outside, and froze. The forest was there. It shouldn't have been. There had been no trees in his backyard yesterday, but now they surrounded his house, tall, twisted, watching. The whispering returned. The trees remember. Daniel turned to run, and something grabbed his ankle, cold, wooden, unrelenting. The last thing he saw before he was dragged into the darkness was the shape of a man, his body made of bark and rot, grinning and whispering, "One must stay." Ethan returns. Daniel was gone. The trees had taken him, and Ethan felt it happen. He had been trying to forget, trying to move on, but that night he woke up gasping, his dreams filled with whispering leaves and a single terrible message. One must stay, one must return. He knew what it meant. The curse wasn't over, and now it was calling him back. Back to the beginning, Ethan arrived in Cooperstown just before midnight. Nothing had changed. The lake was still, the wind was silent, and the woods? They were waiting. The trees felt closer than before, their branches stretching toward the town like outstretched fingers. Ethan took a deep breath. He had no plan, no weapon, no way to fight. But he wasn't leaving without Daniel, so he stepped forward, and the trees let him in. Inside the woods, the forest wasn't a forest anymore. The ground shifted beneath his feet, swallowing the path behind him. He kept walking. Somewhere deep inside, he knew he had walked the same path before. The Holloway estate had fallen, but the curse had never lived in the house. It had always lived in the land itself. The whispering grew louder. One must stay. And then he saw him. Daniel. Changed, Daniel stood in the clearing. But it wasn't really Daniel anymore. His skin had darkened, his veins twisted like roots beneath his flesh. His eyes were hollow knots, empty but aware. And behind him the trees breathed. Ethan took a step forward. Daniel, can you hear me? Daniel's mouth moved, but his voice wasn't his own. The trees remember you. Ethan's heart pounded. Daniel, fight it. For a moment, something flickered in Daniel's face. Some piece of him still trapped inside. Then the shadows lurched forward, and Ethan had to make a choice. The final decision: he could run and save himself. Or he could do something no one had ever dared before. Trade places. Ethan's mind raced. The curse always took someone. But what if he offered himself willingly? Maybe then, just maybe, Daniel could go free. The trees whispered again, waiting. Ethan looked into Daniel's empty eyes and stepped forward. Take me instead. The price of sacrifice. Ethan's words hung in the air like a spell. Take me instead. The trees fell silent. The wind stopped. And for a moment it seemed like the curse had paused, waiting, contemplating. Then, the ground beneath Ethan's feet shuddered, and the roots began to crawl toward him, slow at first, then faster. His skin prickled as the branches reached out, brushing against his arms, his legs. The bark felt like ice. He closed his eyes, preparing for the inevitable. The trees had always taken. No one escaped. But then, the whispering stopped. For the first time since his arrival, the forest was silent. Ethan's heart raced. He dared to open his eyes. Daniel was staring at him, not as a puppet, not as a vessel for the curse, but as himself, the real Daniel. The curse had loosened its grip on him. Ethan felt the roots pull away from his body. The air became clearer, lighter. The weight pressing on his chest, gone. A new beginning, or a new curse. But just as Ethan thought he might be free, the forest spoke. One must stay. It wasn't the trees anymore. It was the land. The ground beneath them rippled, and a dark shape rose from the earth. A figure made of soil, leaves, and roots. The entity looked at Ethan with hollow eyes, just like Daniel's had been. It smiled. The curse is in you now, it whispered. Ethan tried to back away, but the ground seemed to hold him. And then it began to speak again. Only this time, its voice was not just the whisper of trees, but the voice of every soul it had taken over the years. The trees remember. You cannot leave. One must always stay. Ethan realized then, the land itself was cursed. The trees had been only a reflection of its hunger, and now the land was claiming him. The price Daniel reached out, eyes wide with panic. Ethan, no, you can't. But the entity, the land, spoke over him. It was always you. The price is paid. The one who remembers must stay. Ethan looked at Daniel, his heart breaking. Run, Daniel, he whispered. Get out of here. Daniel stumbled back, shaking his head, unable to tear his eyes away from Ethan's trapped form. But the trees, the forest itself, began to shift again. The roots slithered and the ground cracked, swallowing the space between them. Daniel ran. He had no choice. Ethan's fate. Ethan stood still as the land wrapped around him. His skin changed, turning to bark, his veins intertwining with the roots. His body became a part of the forest. One must stay, and now it was his turn. As the last of his human form faded, Ethan could feel the forest's ancient hunger wash over him. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was part of the curse, part of the woods that would forever whisper to those who ventured too close. And so, the whispering pines of Cooperstown would continue. The curse never ended. It only shifted, claiming new souls with each passing generation. A new whisper. As dawn broke over Cooperstown, the woods stood silent, waiting. And somewhere in the depths of the forest, a new voice whispered, "One must stay." The trees would always remember. The echo of the curse. The day after Ethan's sacrifice, Cooperstown felt different. It was as though a thick, suffocating fog had settled over the town, unseen but ever present. The air was heavier now, darker, as if the land itself had changed with the trees. Daniel had made it out. He had escaped the forest. But could he truly leave everything behind? The curse didn't just live in the woods. It had begun to seep into the very soil of Cooperstown. Daniel's return. Daniel had been running, but for how long? Days, weeks, months. He had no answers, just a sense of urgency, an insatiable pull toward the very place he had fled. And so, he returned. Cooperstown wasn't the same. The streets felt silent, even with people going about their daily routines. The sun never seemed to shine quite right, always a shade darker. And when Daniel walked to the outskirts of the town, to the very edge of the woods, the trees bent toward him. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't natural. The trees were alive. They were watching. And Daniel knew. He knew. The curse hadn't just claimed Ethan. It had claimed everything. The reckoning Daniel couldn't outrun it anymore. He stepped into the woods, his legs heavy, as though the earth itself was calling him back. The whispers had grown louder. They were all around him, coming from the trees, the leaves, the soil. One must stay. He heard the words in his bones, in his blood. It was too familiar now. And then he saw it, the Holloway estate. But it wasn't a house anymore. It was a dark silhouette against the sky, something between shadow and reality. The house had changed, just like everything else in Cooperstown. It was alive, pulsing with the same dark energy as the trees. Daniel stepped forward, drawn toward it, until he saw a figure standing in front of the ruins. A man. No, not a man. It was Ethan. But not the Ethan who had walked out of the woods. This Ethan was twisted, his body covered in bark and roots. His eyes were hollow, his skin like dark wood. He was no longer human. He was part of the forest now, a guardian of the curse. "You shouldn't have come back," Ethan's voice echoed, but it was not his voice. It was as if the trees were speaking through him. Daniel froze. He wanted to run, but he couldn't. His feet were planted to the ground. The trees had already begun to root him in place, pulling him toward the hollow center of the forest. One must stay. The choice Ethan's body shifted, and the roots twisted around him, pulling him toward the very heart of the forest. His form cracked and splintered, becoming part of the earth. "You're the last one," Ethan whispered, but the words weren't his own. They were the land's voice. "You must join us." Daniel felt the ground give way beneath him, and before he could stop himself, his body was being pulled into the earth, the roots wrapping around him. He could feel his veins turning to branches, his flesh turning to bark, his breath fading. But in that final moment, something shifted inside him. He remembered the curse was not just about the forest, it was about memory, about the voices, the ones trapped inside the trees, souls bound by the land's hunger. The curse didn't just take, it fed on memory. And Daniel's memory was strong, strong enough to fight, breaking the cycle. With a final surge of will, Daniel pulled himself free, using his own memories as a weapon against the curse. He fought back the trees, the land, the very ground that wanted to claim him. "I will not stay," he screamed, and in that instant, the trees shuddered. The forest screamed back, its roots lashing out, trying to drag him in. But Daniel was no longer just a victim. He had learned. The curse was rooted in the land's hunger for memory, but memories could be broken. With one final cry, Daniel shattered the connection, and for the first time in decades, the forest fell silent. The curse stopped. The aftermath. When Daniel woke up, he was lying on the edge of the forest. The trees were still there, but they no longer watched. The land felt lighter, the air clearer. He stood up, breathing deeply. The whispers were gone. The land no longer felt like it was alive. The curse had finally been broken. The town of Cooperstown was still there. People still lived their lives, unaware of what had happened. But Daniel knew that he had changed. And though the woods were still standing, and the trees were still tall, for the first time in his life, he felt a peace he hadn't known before. The curse was broken, and Cooperstown was finally free. But deep in the heart of the forest, something still whispered, "One must stay." And somewhere, far beneath the earth, the roots waited, hungry, and somewhere, far beneath the earth, the roots waited. Hungry, the roots never die. Daniel thought he was free. The whispers had stopped. The land no longer pulsed with dark energy. Cooperstown was at peace. But deep down, Daniel knew that peace was only a fleeting illusion. The curse wasn't gone. It had only shifted. The trees still stood, their roots still buried deep in the earth, and the land still remembered. The return of the whisper weeks passed. Daniel tried to live a normal life, trying to forget the horrors of the woods, the way the trees had claimed so many souls before. But every night when he closed his eyes, he could still hear it. "One must stay." The words echoed in his mind, like a song that never quite left, a constant hum in the back of his thoughts. And one night, as the moon rose high over Cooperstown, Daniel found himself walking toward the edge of the woods again, as if some unseen force had pulled him. The trees were silent, but they watched. He could feel their eyes on him. And in the distance, he could almost hear a faint whisper, the kind that didn't belong to any living thing. "Come closer." The darkening. As Daniel approached the forest, something changed. The air grew colder, the wind sharper. The trees bent low, almost as if they were bowing to something. Something that had returned. The ground beneath him felt different, alive, restless. And then, in the center of the woods, he saw it. The Holloway estate. But this time it wasn't the ruins. It wasn't the twisted silhouette he'd seen before. It was the house in its full glory, as it had once been, before the curse took hold. The windows glowed with an eerie light, and the door stood open as though waiting for him. "Come inside," a voice whispered, but it wasn't human. It was the voice of the land, the voice of the trees. The whispers were no longer a warning. They were an invitation. The final choice. Daniel stepped toward the house. His feet felt like they were sinking into the earth with each step, as though the land was pulling him in. As he reached the door, it swung open with a creak. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, but there was something else, something ancient, something alive. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight, and the walls seemed to breathe. The house was more than a building. It was a gateway, a place where the curse had been born and where it would never die. In the center of the house, a shadow moved, taking shape. It was Ethan, but not the Ethan who had fought the curse, not the Ethan who had sacrificed himself. This was the thing that had claimed him, the thing that had claimed the land. It was the root of the curse itself, the darkness that had always lived in the land, wearing Ethan's body like a mask. You came back. The voice wasn't Ethan's. It was the land, the earth itself. It spoke through him, its words thick with the hunger of centuries. One must stay. The last surrender. Daniel felt the weight of the words pressed down on him, heavier than the roots beneath his feet. The house, the land, the trees, they were all part of the same thing, a single entity, a curse that would never end. And now Daniel understood. The curse didn't want him to fight it. It didn't want to claim him. It wanted him to join it. The land didn't just remember, it needed memory to survive. It needed one soul to stay, to be a part of the land forever, to become a new root in its unending cycle. As Daniel's body began to change, his veins turning to roots, his skin to bark, he realized that he was the last choice. The curse had fed on him. It had taken his memories, his will, his very soul. And now, he was one with the forest. The final whisper. When dawn broke over Cooperstown, the trees were still standing. The whispers were gone. But as the sun's first rays touched the earth, something deep in the woods stirred. A single low whisper echoed through the trees. One must stay. And somewhere, buried deep in the heart of the forest, Daniel's memory was still alive, rooted in the land, waiting for the next soul to pass through. The curse was never truly broken. It had only found a new way to feed. The roots never die. The return of the roots. The land was silent for a time, but silence is never truly peaceful. It's just the calm before the storm. Cooperstown had been quiet. People went about their daily lives, unaware of the curse that still lingered deep beneath their feet. The trees stood tall, unchanged, untouched, waiting, watching. But the whisper never truly left. It was faint at first, just a distant rustling in the wind, a voice on the edge of dreams. But it was growing louder. And it wasn't just in the forest anymore. It was everywhere. The first sign. One morning, the town awoke to a strange occurrence. People reported seeing something out of place in the streets. Strange markings on their doors, as though carved by some invisible hand. At first, they were dismissed as the work of vandals, but the markings were too intricate, too deliberate, patterns that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. It wasn't long before whispers began to spread. Some believed the markings were warnings. Others believed they were signs. The trees were calling. The town's elders had long told stories of the forest's power, but no one had truly believed in the old tales until now. And then there were the dreams, the dreamers. At night, people began to speak of the same strange dream, a dark forest, the feeling of being watched, the air thick with whispers. In the dream, they would see a figure, Ethan, but not really Ethan. His face twisted and changing, his eyes hollow and filled with ancient knowledge. He would speak to them, but his voice was not his own. It was the voice of the land, the curse that had taken him, and now it sought more. One must stay. As the weeks passed, people started to disappear. They didn't leave. They just vanished. No signs of struggle, no explanation. And each time someone went missing, the trees grew taller, The land seemed to stretch further into the town. No one was sure, but it felt like the town itself was being absorbed by the curse. The return of the roots. One night, in the dead of winter, the first tree reached out. It wasn't just a tree, it was a part of the land, a physical manifestation of the curse itself. The roots shot up through the ground, tearing apart the streets and sidewalks, breaking through foundations. The earth trembled as the trees spread further, twisting their way through the town. No one knew what to do. They tried to run, tried to escape, but the forest followed them. Every corner of Cooperstown was suffused with a dark energy, a heavy air that pressed on their chests, a suffocating weight that drove them to madness. The curse was awake, and it wasn't leaving until it had what it wanted. And then, the screams began. The new guardian. In the center of town, beneath the largest tree, a figure emerged. It was Ethan, but not Ethan. His body had twisted, merged with the land. His form was bark and branches, his face a mask of shadow. The roots had claimed him, and now he stood as the new guardian of the curse. He had become one with the forest, the embodiment of the hunger, the darkness, and the memory of all those the forest had claimed. One must stay, Ethan's voice echoed through the streets, now a deep rumbling growl, a chorus of many voices. The people of Cooperstown gathered in the streets, watching in fear as the trees encroached on them, closing in. They were trapped by the curse that had never truly left. And then, from the shadows, Daniel appeared. The last stand. But this Daniel was different. His form was more like Ethan's, made of bark and roots, but he still had something of his former self left in him. He had remembered what it felt like to be human, to be free. Daniel had been changed by the curse, but he had fought back. He had broken the bond between himself and the land, and now he was back to end it once and for all. He approached the center of town where Ethan, the new guardian, stood. His eyes met Ethan's. "This ends tonight," Daniel whispered, his voice crackling like leaves in a storm. Ethan's hollow eyes flickered. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, a memory of his humanity fighting against the darkness inside. But the land pulled him back, its voice too strong. "One must stay," Ethan whispered again, the curse louder than ever. Terranier voice. The trees roared, their roots rising higher, crushing everything in their path. The ground itself trembled as the forest claimed the final sacrifice. Daniel knew that the only way to break the curse was to sacrifice himself again. He had to become part of the land. He had to become one with it so that the roots would finally stop reaching. And so, Daniel stepped forward. The trees parted for him, and the land accepted him. In that moment, as the roots wrapped around him, as his body began to change once more, Daniel made a final vow to himself. He would end it, not for him, but for everyone who came after. For the last time, the whisper echoed in the wind, but it was quieter now, fainter. One must stay, and the curse fell silent, the eternal root. The forest fell silent once more. But silence is not peace. It is merely the stillness that precedes the next chapter in a never-ending story. When the last root of Daniel's sacrifice had sunk into the earth, when the final breath left his body and his spirit had joined the forest, the curse had seemed to fade. The town of Cooperstown was quiet once more, the ground still and unmoving. But deep beneath the earth, something stirred, the forgotten voices. In the years that followed, Cooperstown continued. Life resumed, as life always does. The town grew, the seasons changed, and memories faded. But there was always something about Cooperstown, something unsettling. Some people would claim to hear strange rustling sounds in the dead of night, like whispers carried by the wind. Others said that certain trees had a way of watching, as if they were not trees at all. And sometimes, late in the evening, the old-timers would gather and speak of a curse, an ancient thing that had once ruled the land. They spoke of roots that reached deep beneath the town, of whispers that never truly stopped. They spoke of Daniel, the last of the guardians, and Ethan, who had once been a man but was now part of the earth. But even the elders did not know the full truth. The unseen path. One crisp autumn evening, a young woman named Lydia arrived in Cooperstown. She had heard the stories, of course. Who hadn't? The dark tales of the Holloway estate, the eerie woods that grew with every passing year, the strange disappearances. She wasn't afraid, though. She was here for something more. Answers. Lydia was a historian, and Cooperstown had always intrigued her. She was determined to uncover the truth. She had done her research, piecing together the cryptic whispers from old journals and faded records. And she had discovered something. There was one truth no one had been able to remember, a truth forgotten by time. Lydia found it in an old weathered journal, buried deep in the archives of Cooperstown's library. The words spoke of a ritual that could not only bind the curse but break it, if one were willing to pay the ultimate price. The journal had been written by a man who claimed to have seen the curse firsthand, a man whose family had been touched by the forest. It spoke of an ancient ritual that could end the cycle once and for all, but it had been lost to history, and Lydia had found it. The ritual of the roots. The ritual, according to the journal, required two things: a willing sacrifice, someone with the strength to face the land, to confront the forest that had claimed so many before them, a bloodline, a person whose ancestors had once made the first pact with the land, whose blood was entwined with the earth's memory. Lydia had no idea who the bloodline was, but she knew she was a sacrifice. She had found the journal. She had come to Cooperstown for a reason. She could feel the land calling to her, feel the whisper just beneath the surface of her thoughts. The gathering of the roots. As Lydia stood at the edge of the forest, the wind picked up, stirring the leaves into a frenzied dance. The trees seemed to lean toward her, their shadows lengthening in the moonlight. The ground beneath her feet felt like it was alive, pulling at her, urging her to come closer. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind. One must stay. Lydia stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the land reaching for her, calling her to take the final step. As she walked deeper into the forest, the trees parted for her. They had been waiting for someone to come, someone with the strength to face the curse, and perhaps to finally end it. The Holloway estate stood before her, but it was no longer a ruin. The house was standing tall once again, a strange, unearthly glow emanating from within. The roots of the trees had wrapped around the house, twisting it into a strange amalgamation of nature and structure. Something that was both alive and decaying. She could feel it. The land was alive, aware of her presence, and somewhere within, the curse awaited. The final confrontation. Inside the house, Lydia found herself face to face with the guardian once more. But this time it wasn't Ethan. It wasn't Daniel. It was the curse itself, a dark, shifting mass of roots and shadows that wore Ethan's and Daniel's faces, their memories twisted and broken, like the land itself. It spoke without a voice, its thoughts swirling in Lydia's mind. You cannot break what has already been done. But Lydia was not afraid. She had come for this. She had come to end it. The journal had described the ritual, the final act that would sever the bond between the land and its curse. It required one final sacrifice, and Lydia was ready. She stepped forward, placing her hand on the roots that had grown like veins through the earth. "I will not be part of this anymore," she whispered, her voice steady, determined. And as she closed her eyes, the land reacted. The roots began to shriek, their grip on the earth loosening. The house shuddered, the air grew heavy, and the very ground seemed to scream in fury. Lydia felt her body begin to change. The land was taking her, pulling her into the earth. But this time it was different. She was not becoming one with it. She was breaking it. The last of the roots. The ground split, and the roots began to retract, pulling back from the house, from the town, from everything. The curse that had plagued Cooperstown for centuries began to unravel. The trees no longer reached for her. They let go. The land had been severed from the past. The curse was no more. Lydia fell to the ground, her body returning to its human form, breathing heavily. The whisper was gone. The land was silent. Cooperstown was free. The aftermath. When Lydia stood, the trees had stopped moving. The forest was still, as if in mourning. The Holloway estate was no longer a dark living entity. It was simply a house crumbling and forgotten. The town of Cooperstown was at peace, its roots no longer tied to the curse. People returned to their lives, unaware of the sacrifice Lydia had made to free them. And as Lydia left the town, she knew that the land would eventually heal. The roots would fade. The memories would finally be gone. But somewhere, deep in the earth, the last whisper still lingered. One must stay. And this time, it was Lydia. The return of the forgotten. Though the curse had been broken, the land was never truly free. Cooperstown had thought itself rid of the shadows that had plagued it for centuries, but something darker was stirring beneath the earth. The roots, though severed, had left their mark, and even the deepest scars can never fully heal. The town had returned to its peaceful ways, unaware of the force that still lingered in the soil. But the land, forever changed, was not done. The first sign of the forgotten. It started small, at first just a unease in the air, a feeling that the town had never truly left the curse behind. People began to experience strange, unexplainable occurrences, strange shapes in the shadows, footsteps that echoed when no one was there, whispers in the breeze that sounded like names, familiar names. Lydia had left Cooperstown, thinking that her sacrifice had ended it all. But the land had remembered, and one night when the moon was high, the forgotten would return. The night of the forgotten Lydia was at home, far from Cooperstown, when she felt it, a tremor, a pull, a connection to the land she had severed. It was faint at first, like a shadow she couldn't quite grasp, but it grew stronger, tugging at her heart. It was a pull she could no longer ignore. She knew without question that Cooperstown wasn't safe. The land had been waiting for her, waiting for the moment when the curse would rise once more. She packed her things and headed back, her heart pounding with dread. The forgotten one's return. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when Lydia entered the town. The streets were eerily quiet. No children played outside. No chatter from the usual markets. The houses stood silent, their windows like empty eyes staring into the void. Lydia's heart raced as she made her way through the town. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, like the town was holding its breath. At the edge of the forest, she saw them, figures, shadows among the trees, figures that didn't belong. They moved, but their forms were blurry, indistinct, as though they were made of the very fog of the forest itself. The curse had not left, it had changed. Lydia stepped forward, calling out, but the figures did not respond. They just moved deeper into the forest, the same forest that had once called to her, the forest that had claimed so many before. The return of the Holloway estate. As Lydia entered the woods, she found the Holloway estate standing once again, but it was not as she remembered it. The house had morphed into something darker. The roots that once reached out had rewoven themselves into the walls, the floors, the very air inside. The house breathed, alive with the whispers of the past. The forest was alive, a twisted reflection of its former self. And in the center of the house stood Ethan, but again, not Ethan. It was a form, a shape, a thing created by the curse, woven from the memories of everyone who had fallen into its grasp. A reflection of the past, not bound by the rules of life or death. The forgotten ones had returned. You thought you could break the cycle, it spoke, its voice an eerie mixture of everyone who had ever been touched by the curse. But the roots never die. The cycle will always return. The final choice. Lydia could feel the pull again. The land wanted her. It needed her. It had made a promise that someone must stay, and now it was her turn. The whispers echoed in her mind, urging her to join the others, to become one with the forest. But this time, Lydia was ready. She had broken the curse before, and she would do it again. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the old journal, the one she had used to find the ritual to sever the curse. It was worn and fragile, but still full of power. She knew what she had to do. The forgotten ones circled her, their forms shifting, their eyes filled with the knowledge of the land. The roots twisted and turned around her, trying to pull her in. But Lydia stood her ground. She could feel the weight of the curse on her, the lives of everyone who had ever been lost to the land. But she was not the same person who had stepped into Cooperstown so long ago. She had already sacrificed herself once, and she would not do it again. With the journal in her hands, she began to chant the ritual once more. The air crackled with energy as the land reacted. The forgotten ones screamed, their voices merging into one, a cacophony of rage and plea. The roots tried to push against her, but Lydia's resolve was stronger than ever. She focused all her energy into the ritual, pushing the curse back, severing the bond between the land and its twisted creations. The ground trembled beneath her, and for a moment she felt the world shift. And then, silence. The aftermath. When Lydia opened her eyes, the land was still. The forest was quiet. The Holloway estate was just a house, its twisted form now broken. The figures that had once roamed the woods had vanished. Cooperstown was free once again, but Lydia knew that the land would never be truly forgotten. The roots were gone, but the memories of those who had sacrificed themselves would always remain. And as Lydia left the town, she knew that the cycle had been broken for now, but the land had a way of remembering, and one day the whispers would return.